Okay.
Thank you for coming today to our Colloquium series. On behalf of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at NYU and its director, Jim Lane, we welcome to the fourth lecture of the Spring Colloquium. Nancy Postero is going to talk about performing indigeneity in Bolivia, masks and protest in the struggle over the TIPNIS. I want to acknowledge our co-organizers, Catherine Smith, Edgardo Perez Morales, and the three of us, myself, Pamela Calle, have organized this series, and we're really proud and glad that you're here, Nancy. Nancy is a long friend of mine. I know her since the 80s, and is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, San Diego. She's the author of Now We Are Citizens, Indigenous Politics in Post-Multicultural Bolivia. She has edited several collections and special journal issues, including The Struggle for Indigenous Rights in Latin America, Living in Actually Existing Democracies, Neoliberalism Interrupted, Social Change and Contested Governance in Contemporary Latin America, The Politics of Indigeneity in Bolivia, Past and Present, and Performance Politics, Spectacular Productions of Culture in Contemporary Latin America. She's completing now a new book focusing on race, politics, and performance in plurinational Bolivia. Your discussant will be our dear colleague Thomas Abercrombie, who's Associate Professor of Anthropology here at NYU, and we welcome you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. My husband and I have had a beautiful weekend here and really enjoyed being in New York City. Thanks to Pamela, my friend and colleague for so many years, to Omar. Is Omar here? He organized all the details, so thanks. I'm going to give a paper today that is a co-written piece with Nikki Fabricant from Towson University and with some collaborations from graduate student Devin Bolio. So I wanted to acknowledge them. I kept going back and forth on my pronouns between I and we, and so whenever I say I really mean we. This is a we paper. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to keep dashing over here. So. In 2011, several hundred lowland indigenous people began the March for Life, for indigenous rights, and for the environment, walking from the lowlands up the Andes to La Paz to protest a proposed highway through their territory known as the TIPNIS. Often wearing only sandals, the marchers covered nearly 1,200 kilometers on their journey from the tropical forests of the Beni region to the cold, dry highlands of La Paz. As they entered Cochabamba, halfway through the journey, they filled the plaza with music and lowland accents. Protesters planted the Bolivian flag in the middle of the plaza, along with a banner bearing the batuhu flower that you see there, a symbol now associated with the lowland indigenous culture. They shouted, "We are defending ourselves from destructive capitalism. Long live the march." Urban residents, students, intellectuals, and NGO representatives joined the rally. Surrounding the plaza, they shouted in unison, "We are all TIPNIS, todos somos TIPNIS." Such performances by indigenous people are not unusual in Latin America, where state development projects often disadvantage local peoples. What was surprising was that this march protested the government of Evo Morales, the indigenous president of Bolivia. The march was in response to Morales' plan to build a highway linking the tropics of Cochabamba to the Brazilian border. The highway was to be funded by the Brazilian National Development Bank, opening new possibilities for trade with Brazil. The Morales government claimed the highway would bring prosperity and trade to lowland peoples and to help the state achieve control of the national territory. But the proposed highway would run through the Isiboro Secure Indigenous Territory and National Park, known by its Spanish acronym TIPNIS, both a forest preserve and a communally held indigenous territory. Some local indigenous communities were pleased with the possibility of the paved road and what it might bring, linking them to bigger cities and markets and bringing increased access to education and healthcare systems. Others, however, I was wondering if I didn't have a map. There's the sign, the trajectory of the road. Others, on the other hand, feared that the road would bring ever greater ecological destruction to a region already deeply affected by cattle ranching, illegal forestry, and coca growing. Many were particularly concerned that it would open up their lands to further colonization by the Andean coca growers who already inhabit one section of the park, the so-called Polígonos 7, which you can see at the very bottom there. The plan created an enormous controversy. One reason was that although the 2009 Constitution requires the state to carry out a prior consultation with any indigenous communities that might be affected by its development projects, the Bolivian government did not do so in this case. Instead, President Morales notoriously declared, like it or not, we will construct this highway. As a result, opponents claimed that the highway was a form of renewed internal colonialism. To register their opposition, especially to the lack of consultation, the Confederation of Bolivian Indigenous Peoples, CIDOB, and the National Council of Ayllus and Marcas of Cuyasuyo, CONAMAC, mounted 2 nonviolent marches. The first, in 2011, captured international attention when the National Police intervened in the small town of Chaparina, tear gassing and firing rubber bullets at the protesters, including women and children. This changed the public debate substantially, and when the march finally did arrive in La Paz, it received a massive and warm welcome. Morales was forced to declare the park intangible, or untouchable, and to carry out an ex post facto prior consultation. Some communities were satisfied with the results of the march and the government's concessions, but others were not, and in 2012, CIDOB mounted a second march to protest the consultation process. The 2012 march received much less public attention than the previous year, in part because the lowland organizations were really split on whether marching again was a good idea. When they did arrive in La Paz, they were unable to obtain any concessions for the government, and so they returned home empty-handed. However, the road still has not been built. After the government's consultation produced a pretty predictable result, substantial approval of the highway, Morales suspended the plan pending what he called elimination of extreme poverty in the region. In 2014, however, MAS officials made it clear that the highway project is indeed still in the works. In this talk, to contribute to what your series is looking at in terms of political imaginations, I want to focus on the political performances and the tropes and the ideas and the symbolism that we saw emerging around the TIPNIS controversy. And this is one of millions of online posters and images that I'll show you a number of them, but a lot of them resulted. This is the third in a series of works that Nikki Fabrikant and I have written about the TIPNIS case. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the other pieces so you'll understand that while this one is really discursive and performative, that's not all I do. That is what I'm going to be focusing on this. In the first paper, we focused on the ways that the lowland civic elites allied with the TIPNIS protesters to oppose the Morales administration. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this paper. In the second, we placed the struggles about TIPNIS in the context of the long-term political economy of the lowlands region, especially the racialized labor regimes associated with agricultural commodity production and resource extraction. So in this piece, we turn our attention to the narratives told and contested through political performances during the controversy. Following Povinelli, I'll argue that the performances acted to condense long-term economic, political, and cultural tensions into an event. I'll show how a complex situation was distilled through performances and symbolic representations into a dualistic debate with deeply ethical repercussions. So my goal here is to show how performances themselves constituted this event through reiterated and disputed representations or figurations of indigeneity. And my hope is that this will help us complicate our understandings of both indigeneity and resistance, and also to see how important performances are on the to the political realm and to the political imagination. So let me step back for a minute to put the TIPNIS case into a little bit of historical context. It's nice to be speaking to a group of Latin Americanists, so I don't have to give you too many details. I know you already know much of this, but just on the off chance you don't know, I think I'll tell you a little bit about the Morales and the MAS. Evo Morales and his movement towards socialism party came to power in 2005, challenging the neoliberal policies of previous regimes and promising to redistribute the patrimony of the country to its poor and indigenous populations. This anti-neoliberal agenda was paired with a promise to decolonize the Bolivian state, to overcome the structures and practices of racism against its majority indigenous population, and to implement a new vision of sustainable development based on indigenous cosmovisión called Vivir Bien, or Living Well. The 2006 Constituent Assembly and the Constitution that it produced in 2000 and 2009 marked a radical change for Bolivia, which had previously been governed by white mestizo political class. The new Constitution declared Bolivia to be a plurinational state and declared the fundamental goal of the new state was to decolonize Bolivia. Thus, Morales and the MAS were charged with bringing into being a new revolutionary state and institutionalizing a proceso de cambio, or a process of change. Bolivian sociologists Torres and Arce argue that in this interregnum period, a key task of the new government was to reconstitute and reconstruct a symbolic order as well as a political order. The MAS represented itself as both a continuity of the past, that is, past forms of national sovereignty, and here you can see the heroes of the wars of independence in the 1952 revolution in the center banner, as well as something else and something radically different. And you can see that represented by the anti-colonial heroes on the left and indigenous activists on the right. So it was in this context of state consolidation that the TIPNIS controversy exploded. The MAS government had done a remarkable job of constructing a hegemonic national narrative, and its development model had fueled an economic boom. Yet the highway project really drew attention to the deep contradictions the MAS narrative masked, and masks, I would say, including fundamental questions about the state's ongoing natural resource extractivist development model. In their history of the development of the English state, historians Corrigan and Sayer suggest that the repertoires of practices and institutions that we conventionally identify as the state are probably better thought of as cultural forms intended to construct a unified nation out of the diverse and often conflicting segments of society. And here, of course, they rely on Philip Abrams' provocative argument that the idea of the state acts to conceal the real history and relations of subjection behind an ahistorical mask of legitimating illusion. Rather than something hidden behind the mask of political practice, Abrams argued, the state is the mask obscuring practices of domination. In this paper, Nikki and I use the idea of masking to consider what's at stake in contemporary Bolivia. Needless to say, we were not the first to use the metaphor of mask to understand the TIPNIS case. Given the deep contradictions between the government's discourses and its deeds, indigenous activists, scholars, and NGO workers commonly express their concerns regarding the MAS state in these terms. And in 2012, a high-profile group of intellectual dissidents issued a manifesto entitled The Mascarada del Poder, the Masquerade of Power, with a mask of Morales on the cover. So we didn't come up with this idea, but we do try to build on and complicate these notions of masking in two ways. First, we examine how political performances by the Bolivian state, and particularly by Bolivian President Morales, acted to legitimate the social and political order, masking the form of domination involved. Krupa and Nugent, in their really great new volume on the Andean state, following Abrams' lead, ask, by what sets of practices, material, discursive, ritual, and performative, do people come to accept, or not, states as real or enduring parts of the social landscape? They argue that fantasy, fear, violence, and delusion play a central role in the production of that rule, but that this is concealed by state claims to neutrality and rationality. So we first start thinking about political performances by the state. And second, we consider how political performances en masse can be creative tools for social movements opposing and negotiating with the state. But I want to be clear that this is not just an oppositional notion of subaltern resistance to coercive state power. Instead, as I hope you'll see in the paper, we analyze how the actors claiming to unmask the state may in fact be engaged in a complicated dance with the state instead. In the process, they create their own masks, often taking up one-dimensional tropes of indigeneity that mask other inequities. Thus, we're not trying to unearth the truth behind these many masks that we describe, but rather to show what's produced by this complicated and set of interlinked performances. Finally, to understand the powerful symbols at play in this case, we draw on Donna Haraway's notion of figurations. We do that a little bit more in the longer paper. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but I think her idea of figurations are so helpful. She suggests that figures are, and figurations are potent, embodied, incarnated, if you will, fictions that collect up the people in a story that tends to fulfillment, to an ending that redeems and restores meaning in a salvation history. I think you'll see as we go forward why that works for this paper. Haraway explored the figures at play in contemporary science discourses, showing how these narratives constructed categories that then became accepted as truth. But she also uses figurations as a radical feminist strategy to imagine new realities like the cyborg that escape the dualisms of nature, culture, male-female, and rationality imagination, resetting the stage for possible paths and futures. So we are indebted in this paper to Haraway. So Evo Morales' government has used indigenous histories, bodies, and storytelling and performances since its inception. This is a well-known picture. He began his administration with a memorable inauguration ritual at the archaeological complex at Tiwanaku, where he was blessed and cleansed by Aymara spiritual leaders. There, invoking the Aymara notion of Pachacuti, or the reversal of the world order, he declared the beginning of a new millennium for indigenous peoples of the continent. For every critical legislative reform, Morales rallies support through spectacular events mobilizing indigenous history and tales of oppression and injustice. For instance, when Morales passed the new agrarian reform law in 2006, he organized social movement activists in the city of Peñas, the site of the brutal death of 18th century anti-colonial Aymara revolutionary Tupac Katari. Addressing thousands of peasant farmers, he declared, "I stand before you today at the site where Julian Tupac Katari, one of the few literate Indian slaves, was descuartizado, or quartered. We are here to liberate our country, and Katari is the principal reference point for the indigenous struggles in Bolivia, and a constant reminder of the obligation to decolonize Bolivia." Through these symbolic and performative events, Morales created a new figuration in which he embodied the spirit of Katari as the leader of a movement liberating the country from a colonialist and racist history. And it's a very powerful effect in Bolivia. Here we see the hegemonic redemption story that I was talking about from Haraway, where the new state promises to put the evil of colonialism in the past and lead the way to a future of justice. Morales also incorporates the story of social movement struggles in his own person, becoming a figure that represents all Bolivians, and especially all indigenous people. After Morales' 2014 re-election, enormous billboards announced "Todos somos Evo," or "Yo soy Evo," or "Nosotros somos Evo." We are, I am, we all are Evo.